today's Bible reading is Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 34. Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read this passage of Scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Then the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him, because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. Later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others, because you pay no attention to who they are. But you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought the coin and he asked them, "Whose image is this and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. Then the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife with no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow, but he also died, leaving no child. It was the same with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her?" Jesus replied, "Are you not in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God? When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now, about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, 'I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob'? He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken." One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this: 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.'" "Well said, teacher," the man replied. "You are right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions.
So as we get to chapter 12 here, the big thing that we saw in the lead up to this passage was that Jesus has now been revealed to everyone as this king that has been long awaited for. That whilst who he is up until now had been kept secret and not all had been revealed, and he was even actually very strict on keeping it that way. He kept telling his disciples, don't tell anyone this or this other thing. Well, after entering the city on the donkey and having had people shout out at that time, Hosanna, that he's come to save the people, and this is what they are now all waiting for. Well, after that whole event has just happened, there's really no way from this point forward hiding who Jesus is, as now everyone in Jerusalem, in the city, would be very aware of what had just happened and that Jesus is this true king that had been promised long before. And even if the people in the city somehow missed all that happening, if they weren't aware of what was really going on and they hadn't figured out who he was presenting himself to be as he rode in on a donkey like King David and the kings before him, well, after entering into the city, there's no way the Jews at the temple and the leaders who are up there could have missed this point as Jesus went into the temple and he started rebuking those there, and he drove out anyone who was in there using it as a marketplace. And what this shows is Jesus has gone from being fairly quiet and mostly not confrontational with those that he came across before the transfiguration to now coming out in the open, and he's challenging their beliefs in what it is that they do and what they teach, right? The way he's entered into the city and the way he went up to the temple, now it's becoming very clear who he is and the decisions that the people now have to make. Which is why, as we now get into this particular passage, we now start to see the consequences of all those previous events, as this is where Jesus has now become a real problem that actually has to be dealt with. Because what we actually see here is a conspiracy of several different players that have all decided that there's a Jesus problem that has to be dealt with, that he's got to be silenced. That anyone who up until now may have considered Jesus perhaps a bit of a nuisance, but not a real threat. He's just been a bit annoying, but nothing to really worry about. Or even if anyone had really missed a lot of what had happened, and therefore they just didn't really care who this guy was. They weren't paying attention. They didn't even know his name, and they didn't really care if anything had gone on before this. Well, after now coming into the city as a king, and after challenging directly the way things are done and pushing against what is the establishment, the leaders of the city, the religious leaders, well, now everyone has come onto this field of players. This is no longer a problem that can just be ignored. Everyone now realizes that things will either have to be done Jesus's way, or if they want it done their way going forward, then they're going to have to do something. People are going to have to make a choice, as these two ways, what Jesus is presenting and what they have, they're opposed. And what they can see is that Jesus seems to be winning the hearts of the crowd. His ways actually seem to be coming out ahead, and they're now under threat. Which is why what we get here, just after all these events have taken place, several prominent groups at the time that were in Israel, and particularly in Jerusalem, they're now conspiring against Jesus because he's considered to be a threat to each of them in their leadership. Now, from what we see here until what will be the end of the book, right, when Jesus finally gets killed, they're now going to work together in secret because they fear what it is that he stands for. And they're afraid of what it is that he might actually accomplish. So they essentially hate who he is. That's what it's now become. They hate him. But as we go through this conspiracy now and we unpack what is going on here, what we need to be thinking about is really the big lesson that we're going to get from this for today. Because this passage here, whilst it mentions names of people and groups we might not really know and we might not really care as we just sort of read through it, it actually tells us so much about how the world sees Jesus. And it shows us that the hearts of people, those who don't live for God, and how it is they're going to respond to any challenge to their beliefs. So this therefore shows us how we should expect the gospel message to be received in a world that today is still full of sin and still has corrupt hearts. And it shows this and then helps us to understand what we actually see in our own society today, and also shows us how it is that we should respond to that. What we should expect when you take that gospel message out to the world around us, and how we should respond to their response to us. Because when we start going through what is happening in this passage, we see there's actually a lot that we can get from this, besides the famous quotes of love your neighbor and give to Caesar what is Caesar's that come from this chapter, the ones that a lot of people know, because there's a reason that these things are actually being said in the first place. And it's a response to the sin at that time. That's why Jesus was saying these things. And then by looking at that, this helps us really understand what is the nature of sin and why it is that this gospel that Jesus brings, that should be something welcomed and accepted, and is welcomed and accepted by many, why it actually can still cause such incredible offense to those whose hearts are too hard to believe it, and why that kind of hard-heartedness is still going to be at play to those who take the gospel out today. So looking at the first part of the passage now, and how it is that this conspiracy starts. What it is that gets the ball rolling, and what got them so fearful that they've all now come together against Jesus. We see this starts off with Jesus telling what is a simple parable. And why this parable will kick this conspiracy off is because what he's going to say will very much explain what has been happening all through the Gospel of Mark. And it's going to also show that even before that, where Israel went wrong, and why it is he came up and why he cleared out the temple just before saying this. Because this is basically him laying out what has been going on in Jerusalem for centuries and making it clear who the players all are and why they will soon kill him before that very week that he said this is over. Because we see it starts with Jesus talking about a vineyard and how the owner first built up the infrastructure of this vineyard, and then he rented it to some farmers to look after he left. But then we see in verse 2 that when the harvest came, he sent a servant to collect some of the fruit, but these farmers beat him up and they gave him nothing. And then we see this happens again in verse 4, and then again in verse 5, but this time they actually kill the servant that was sent. And then the rest of that verse shows that this went on, and the same thing just kept happening. Because it says he sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. So at this point, these people have just taken the vineyard for themselves. And their actions show that they're going to do whatever it takes to keep it for themselves. They know it's not theirs, they know it's the owner's, but every time he sends someone, they beat them and kill them. And then we get the important verse in verse 6, the part that then shows what this is really about, right? All these parables, they always mean something. Now we're starting to get what this is all pointing towards. Because it says now, he had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, they will respect my son. So we can already see just by this what this is all about, right? Just using our own biblical knowledge, we can bring this all together. Because as talked about last week, Israel is the vineyard. It was placed there by God to grow fruit and to be of value to him, to serve his purposes. And yet, as we saw with the fig tree, it was all leaves and no fruit, so it looked good and healthy from afar. When you looked at it from a distance, it looked, oh, there's a healthy tree. But then when you looked up close, it had produced nothing. And now it says here, there were servants sent to collect the fruit of this vineyard, which means that if Israel was that vineyard, then these are obviously the prophets. These are the faithful people of God who were sent to Israel over and over again, but over and over again, they were beaten and killed and rejected by those who had taken over. And if that is the case, then that obviously means that the farmers, the ones left in charge of the vineyard who are causing all these problems, they're the religious leaders. These are the priests. These are the teachers, because they're the ones who, as we know, as we read through the Old Testament, they're the ones who killed the prophets. And they're the ones who destroyed Israel, leaving it fruitless. It was by their sin and what they had done in leading the people away. This is why they were sent off to exile in the first place. And while when they came back, they were never the nation they once were. So as that is what is being said here, it's actually a story just simply reflecting the history of Israel. It's showing the situation of Jerusalem at that time. And then this is why when it says the Son, well, we know that this is actually talking about Jesus. Especially when it says a son whom he loved, as that is exactly what God had said both at Jesus' baptism and also at his transfiguration. But now after establishing that, now we get the big message here. The event that shows all that is going on in this parable and why Jesus is talking about it. What he wants to teach by what he's saying here. Because then it says, but the tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. So this now is actually Jesus predicting his death. He's now saying this is what they will do to him. As he said to the disciples several times now, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. Now he's making it clear he is the son and they're going to kill him. And more than that, he's saying this is why they will do it. That is because he is the Son of God. That's clear by what he's saying, as he's the son in the parable. And he's going as far as to say that they will kill him knowing that he is the Son. They're not totally ignorant as to who has been sent to them. That their sin has gotten to the point that they no longer even care what truth is, because all they want is power and control, which is what we'll see as this conspiracy unfolds. But before we get to that, we do see in verse 9 that Jesus makes it clear that because of this kind of stuff, judgment is coming on these people. That whilst they'll kill him, in the end, the Father will bring judgment on them for this, and he'll then give the vineyard that they've stolen to others. Obviously meaning that the kingdom that the Son brings, it's going to be given to the Gentiles, it's going to be given to us, as those who were to serve it, these leaders, well, they've disqualified themselves. Which is why we get the famous quote from Psalm 118 now given. It's something that's quoted here, but it's also quoted in Matthew and Luke, and it's also quoted in Acts 4 and also in 1 Peter 2. Right? It's one of the most well-known Old Testament quotes used in the New Testament. It's referenced a lot of times. And it's quoted all these times as it clearly shows exactly what is going on here and what this rejecting son is all really about and what it looks like. Because it says, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it's marvelous in our eyes. So this is showing that the cornerstone, if you think of when they build a building, the special stone that is laid and then everything else is built from, right? Everything's measured from that point. It's the most important part of the entire structure. This is saying that the stone that was rejected, the one that found a stone, they've gone, oh, that's not good enough to be the cornerstone for what we're building here. It's not good enough. That was actually the perfect stone. It was rejected, but it was perfect. And what Jesus is saying here by quoting the psalm is that he's the cornerstone. He's the Son of God, the one the kingdom is built from, but the leaders have rejected him because of their blindness. They've dismissed him because of their sin. And what's amazing about this passage is that as he says all that, and he explains how to reject him, that's what the parable's all about. That's what this quotation from Psalms is all about. As he's saying all this, we then see this very thing now happen. That just as Jesus tells this parable, explaining what this is all about, and quotes Psalm 118, showing how this will be the case, we then read in verse 12, then the chief priests, the teachers of the law and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But then it says they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. So this is actually why they're going to have no excuse, because they can literally see this parable is about them. They're actually really getting what Jesus is saying here, and yet instead of changing their ways and seeing where they've gone wrong, instead they just go out and they do the very thing that the parable was talking about. Because the parable said, in their sin and their selfishness, these leaders will kill the Son of God and they'll try to keep the kingdom for themselves. And the first thing these leaders do upon hearing this is to look for a way to arrest Jesus, which is why just a few days after this, he would then be dead on a cross. So the big thing to see here is, and this parable here sets this up, is what is going to now happen because of what Jesus has said. The rest of what we're looking at and what we'll see running up all the way to Easter, it's all really coming down to what was just said here in this parable. That Jesus not only entered as a king and rebuked their practices at the temple and stopped their business, but he's now spoken a parable that actually shows their corruption and what their motives are, why he's done all this. And now, amazingly, that very parable actually gets proven to be true. It's almost a spark that starts the fire. Because as he speaks about this, they're now going to immediately go out and conspire with other groups to now have Jesus killed, just as he said. Because now as we read on, we see what the plan will be to get Jesus arrested and to try and get the people to turn against him, as now different groups are all going to take turns in asking Jesus questions that are set up to be no-win situations. That they're going to give him a couple of options. They come to him with a question and it's like, what should we do? But if he says A, then they will say that he's rebelled against God and he's a sinner. That's what they'll hold against him. But if he says B, they'll simply say that he's rebelled against the government and therefore he's a danger to everyone. So the whole point of all of this is to get him to say something that will then get him offside with someone, some other group, and then use that to bring him down. It's to try and turn at least some of the people against him so they can then silence him and even get him killed. And we see this first start to play out with what is a question about taxes. That after some false words about how he has integrity and is a man of God, something that they obviously don't believe or they wouldn't be doing any of this. We then get the first question from them, which is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we pay? There's the A or the B. And they ask this as they know that if he says yes, pay those taxes, then that means he supports the Romans and he's not actually faithful to God. He's an enemy of Jerusalem and Israel. But if he says no, then he's rebelling against the Romans and he's therefore an enemy of them, and retaliation is going to come from them. So the trap simply is that one way or another, he is going to upset what is basically half the people there, depending on what side they are on, depending on what they think is the right answer to that question that only has two options. Which is why we see that this first question, it is brought to him by what is two rival groups. That one of the groups asking this are those who support the current government, while the other one doesn't. Two different groups that actually have two different answers to that question. Because it says now in verse 13, later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. So the first thing to note is, it says they sent some, which is showing this really is part of a plan, right? This is where it becomes a conspiracy. It's not just some random groups asking him questions, which has happened along the way, but they're being sent for the purpose of catching him out. There's a reason these two particular groups have been sent together. And we see this get exposed in verse 15, because after they asked the question, it then says, but Jesus knew their hypocrisy, which is why he didn't ask them, why are you trying to trap me? So you can see what is going on here. And you can see why it is that the Pharisees and Herodians have been sent together. Because the Herodians, as the name suggests, support the Herods. Herod once being the king who was put in power by the Romans long before Jesus was born. So they're a political party and they want to keep what is the current setup, which is the Romans in ultimate control and the local Herod family ruling the land. But whilst the Herods rule over Judea and Jerusalem, they're not actually even Israelites. They're Edomites. They come from what is the line of Esau, the brother of Israel. So they're not Jews. They're cousins of the Jews, but these cousins have had a long history of conflict, and the Herods, therefore, are not wanted by the Jews. They're not themselves Jewish by family line. So therefore, the actual Jews want them gone. So the people in Jerusalem obviously want the Romans and the Herods gone, as they're waiting for the time that the kingdom of David can be rebuilt and they can be independent again. They're waiting for that long-awaited king. But the Herodians are trying to keep this Edomite family in power, and they want the Romans to stay in control, and they are therefore afraid of what is a Jewish uprising. They don't want this new Jewish kingdom. But this is why the Pharisees, like the rest of the Jews, have no love for the Herods or the Romans, because they want that. They want the Jewish kingdom. They are Jewish. So this means that the Herodians are actually their enemies. The Pharisees actually want the Herodians gone, because what the Pharisees envisioned for the future of Judah and what the Herodians want Judah to remain as, these are two very different things, which is why these two groups fundamentally hate each other. They hate each other because they've got different visions of the future. They've got nothing in common. And when we look at what they stand for, they're simply incompatible with each other. They would answer that question very differently. But the thing is, and what we're seeing here is, despite these differences, they're conspiring together to bring Jesus down because they hate him even more. Now, for both groups, he's a threat, and it's a threat that needs to be dealt with. Because for the Herodians, if Jesus is the king bringing about a new kingdom, as he just rode into Jerusalem as a king, and they called out Hosanna to him, that's what the people screamed out, then he will destroy what they're looking to keep, this Herodian dynasty. So they're fearing that he might create a Jewish uprising, as people believe he is the Messiah, he is the true king, and they'll start a revolt. But for the Pharisees, they too are fearful that people might follow Jesus and start a revolt, and then the Romans are going to come and destroy them all. In fact, we see this even said in John 11. This is from verses 47-48, which is happening during this time, just before Jesus had entered into Jerusalem. We see that they meet to plot against Jesus and have him killed. This is a conspiracy at work. And we read them say, here is this man performing many signs, right? This is the indication that they know Jesus is something special. He's performing signs. They can see it. And then they say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So for the Pharisees, even though they want the Romans gone, they don't want what would be perhaps a failed attempt that is then going to result in repercussions. And they're afraid Jesus will get such a following that there will be an attempt and then the Romans will have to react. But even more than that, they don't want to be free of the Romans if they're not the ones in control of what is left. And as Jesus said, and as just said, Jesus has entered in as a king, and when he's done that, he's actually challenged the order of things. There actually would be, if there is a revolt in the new kingdom, a new place where they are not in power. So that's a real issue for them here. It's the fear that even if Jesus did throw off the Romans, there'll obviously be no place for them in this new kingdom. So like the Herodians, they also want to cling to power, and they're afraid Jesus might take it from them. So what this ultimately means is that whilst they both hate each other, and they clearly do, they do not stand for the same things. And as said, with that question, they would both answer different things. Even though they hate each other, they hate Jesus even more, so they're willing to work together. That's the motive here. Jesus is a common enemy, and as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And of course, this shows none of these people care about the truth. That is really what the parable was talking about. They don't care about the well-being of the people. This is all politics, and the ways of God get in the way of politics. So they're prepared to team up to eliminate Jesus because they hate what he stands for, and they only care about themselves. Now, of course, as this plays out, we see that this trap is a failure. That Jesus simply says to bring to him a coin, and he asks those who are asking this question. He says, the image and inscription, what's on it? And then when they say Caesar's, he famously says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And we can see by their response, it says, and they were amazed at him. And of course, this means that they had no comeback. So he hasn't really upset anyone because he's not denying God. And he's not denying that the Romans actually are in power here. Instead, he's simply saying, give what belongs to who, what is theirs. He's offered C, basically. They've offered A and B, and he's saying, really, it's both of the above when it's appropriate. But what we're seeing here is really the first attempt of a trap here. The first attempt to trap him. And we're seeing that they're so corrupt and so desperate to get rid of Jesus that you'd even get to a situation where these two rival groups who have historically hated each other want two very different things. They're willing to come together to catch him out because they hate him even more. And what we also see is that they failed completely because he didn't say anything that they could object to. They're so blind in their hatred that they haven't even thought of what is a different way. Now, we first looked at the Herodians and the Pharisees and their failed attempt to trap Jesus. But then after them, we now get what is another group, and another group having a shot at Jesus. We see that the next group to have a go at him are called the Sadducees. And they're now going to try to get him on an issue of theology, not politics. And this group, the Sadducees, were part of the Jewish religious order at the time. They're just like the better-known Pharisees. They play a part in what is the religious function of the nation. And in fact, they were the ones who actually looked after the temple. They're the priests of the temple, the ones that Jesus obviously would have angered just before this when he went in and started overthrowing the tables in the temple. So whenever we talk about the priests at the temple, these are the ones we're talking about, not the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they looked after the synagogues, as both groups had their own little areas of control and influence. And whilst they both sit in the Sanhedrin, which was like the highest court, there was 70 of them from both groups brought together, and they ruled on matters of dispute, and they were really where all the power was, and they're the ones, as we'll see, will ultimately decide to have Jesus killed. Even though they all rule together in this group, they do have fundamentally different beliefs. Because the Sadducees, their position is, if it's not clearly stated in the Pentateuch, which is the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, then it's not to be believed. And this resulted in them having a very limited view of things, as they actually ignore what is therefore most of the Old Testament. They only held to those first 5 books. That's all they held to up at the temple, the sacrifices, all that ritual stuff. And because of this, because of their narrow and strict beliefs, they don't believe in what is the resurrection of the dead. This is the stuff promised and talked about in the rest of the Old Testament. So the Sadducees, they're the temple workers, and they're there worshipping God up at the temple, making these sacrifices for sins and all this, but they don't actually believe in the afterlife. They don't believe in what is judgment after death. They don't believe that there is a heaven and a hell. They don't believe in spiritual beings. So what they believe in is much more limited than what the Pharisees and the rest of the Jews believe in. They're simply limited to what is the religious practices at the temple. And for them, it means you simply live your life, and when you die, that's it. Which means it's almost atheistic. They worship God, but they're almost like atheists. It just has all this religious ritual stuff thrown in, and the belief of reward is actually in this life now. That the curses and promises get applied to this life now, depending on how you've lived. And understanding that belief helps us understand the question that they now put to Jesus. It helps us understand just why they ask this particular question. And also helps to show how manipulative this question is, what they're actually going for. Because just like the Herodians and Pharisees before, they start with the whole teacher address, like they actually respect him. They don't, but it's the same pattern. And then after the flattery, their question is, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. And then they go on about this whole thing about how each brother after marrying the widow dies, and then the brother takes over until she has actually had 7 husbands. And it's all legal in that sense. It's all brothers basically rescuing their sister-in-law. And then after laying out this situation, they then ask the question to trap him. This is where it all comes in. It says, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be since the 7 were married to her? So you can see how manipulative the question is. That, like the one by the Herodians and Pharisees, they're actually going to care nothing for the answer. Right? Clearly, this is not something they would even consider. They just want to catch Jesus out because they don't even believe in the afterlife. They don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe people will be saved from death to live with God. They don't believe it, yet the question is about heaven and the resurrection. So they don't believe it, but they ask Jesus anyway because they want him to say something that either contradicts his other teachings or contradicts the laws of God, or just upsets one of the other groups there. If he doesn't upset them, he's hoping he'll upset the Pharisees. But this is what Jesus says, and unlike the answers before where he outsmarts them with the tax question, here he actually just takes the Sadducees head on. He doesn't offer them a C, another option. He just puts the doubt back onto them. Because he says here, are you not in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God? And then he goes on to say that the dead will rise and they will be like angels in heaven. And then after speaking of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who all died in this world long ago, that's the point, they all died long ago, he then says, he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, because God was still speaking of them as being, am I not the God of these people who died a long time ago? So Jesus has shown they don't actually understand God's word for themselves. They don't understand that even in their little Pentateuch, their 5 books, it was already clear that there is life after death. So just like the Pharisees, the Sadducees have actually failed to trap Jesus. If anything, they actually end up falling into their own trap. That they've come here with what they think is a very creative question, but it actually shows they don't understand the situation. But the important thing to point out here is that, like the 2 groups before them, they're also hated by the Pharisees. It's not just the Herodians that they have an issue with. In fact, the hostility between these 2 groups, the Pharisees and Sadducees, it's a big theme in the New Testament. Because if we look at the book of Acts, we see that Paul even used this division between these 2 groups to his advantage. That when he got called into the Sanhedrin, right, the big mixed court made of both factions that was mentioned before, when he gets called in to answer for the gospel message that he is spreading, and he's going around telling people, believe in Jesus, believe that Jesus will save you from death. While standing before them in the Sanhedrin, we read this. This is Acts 23, verse 6. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, he called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. So Paul uses the resurrection to make his argument for the gospel of Jesus. He's saying, I believe the same thing you do in this regard. I believe in the resurrection. And then it says after that in the next verse, when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And this causes the whole place to erupt. The Pharisees side with Paul, obviously, because they believe in the resurrection, and a massive fight breaks out between them and the Sadducees. In fact, we see it actually gets so heated that a couple of verses later, it says that the commander who was there was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he actually had to send the army in to save him. So what we see is, whilst they all hate each other, because what they believe, it's all incompatible. They're all on different pages here. All these groups, somehow, amazingly, they're conspiring together to bring Jesus down. That the very question the Sadducees asked would actually infuriate the Pharisees. They would be so angry at that question, and yet they're happy for them to ask Jesus as long as they think it's going to catch him out, as long as it serves their purposes. And that's really the big issue at play here in this passage. Even mortal enemies, they're coming together if it means opposing God's ways. And they're doing this because that is what sin does. It's leading them to believe that their power in society was more important than the truth. That's what the parable was illustrating. That for each of these groups, holding power, it means more to them than true devotion to God. So whilst they all hate each other, they're willing for the meantime to work together to get rid of Jesus as they hate him even more. But before we finish up, having outlined what this conspiracy is, why it's happening, there is one last thing to quickly look at, and it's the last part here of the passage. And it's interesting because here we see someone who is a teacher of the law, but despite that, he doesn't seem to be involved in this conspiracy. He's come to Jesus for very different reasons. Because it starts here by saying one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. So he doesn't seem to be a part of the plan. He's just there or just walking past, and he seems genuinely interested in what's going on here, what has to be said. And we see this because it says, noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? So he seems to really want to know something. That he's generally impressed by how Jesus dealt with these groups. So he now asks a question that he actually wants an answer to. And the answer that Jesus gives to this question is probably one of the most famous statements Jesus ever made. And it's one that gets quoted all the time. It's one that people don't even go to church would obviously say and probably even use against people who do go to church. Because he says in verse 30, in answer to that question, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, and this is the one that gets used all the time, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And then after saying this, we see that the man agrees with Jesus. He doesn't disagree. And then after repeating what Jesus said, he goes on and says basically the same thing again, but then he also adds, to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. So whilst being essentially one of them, a teacher of the law, he is clearly the opposite of these other groups. Because where they've got caught up, particularly the Sadducees and that, in the offerings and sacrifices, and of course the Pharisees got caught up in all the laws and the rituals and all this stuff, all this self-righteousness. We see that instead, he actually says, love is more important than all that. He realizes what it is that God wants, which is a comment that really highlights the sin of those other people. Because what we can actually see by what is unfolding here, what we saw in that parable and everything that's happened after this, there is no love in them. Their questions, they were just a big conspiracy. And they came from a place of hate. And their attitude, as Jesus says, it was hypocritical. Because it's all part of laying the trap, and it's not genuine. They didn't really care for the answers. They're even asking questions that they themselves would not agree with. Which is why, in contrast to them, this man actually hears the answers Jesus gives. He's impressed by them, and we see Jesus then say to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And then says that they all stopped this game of trying to trap Jesus because they didn't dare ask him any more questions. At this moment, they're realizing that they've lost this game, right? It's not going to work. And even some of their own were actually now turning towards Jesus, right? The questions they've asked, funnily enough, has even led a man like this, one of the teachers of the law, to then go, oh, actually, maybe Jesus is the smarter one here. Maybe he's onto something. So here's how the conspiracy is all starting to fall apart. As Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor, and as the man says that doing this matters more than all those empty sacrifices, this is how those who are holding on to those empty sacrifices have actually become exposed to everyone there for what they really are. It's becoming clear that they've conspired to damage Jesus. Instead, it's actually only damaged themselves, as even a teacher of the law, not a part of this conspiracy, has come to agree with Jesus as well. Now, having looked at all that, the question then is, what can we actually learn from all this now, seeing how this conspiracy came about? Right? What lessons do we get from the way these groups, who all disagreed and even hated each other, how they've all come together to trap Jesus? Right? Obviously, there's got to be a lesson that we can get from this passage here. And there are probably a few things that we can see from this. We can see how these people came for Jesus and how they conspired to get rid of him. And we can also see how Jesus responded to them and why he could respond to them in the way that he did. By these things, we actually learn quite a few things. Because the first thing we should get from this is understanding just how much the world really hates Jesus. Probably of all the passages in all the New Testament and all the Gospels, this is the one that really shows it the clearest. Because we can see from their pre-meeting that happened, before they came together to question him, we see from that they didn't have a real reason to hate him. That it's not like Jesus is actually actively targeting them. That's not really what's going on. He hasn't started a war. Instead, they hated him because the people were following him. And this has got them afraid that they're going to lose their political power. They're going to lose control of the vineyard. They're afraid they're going to lose the devotion of the people, and therefore they're going to lose their privilege from the Romans, because if they can't control the people, then they lose their usefulness in Rome's eyes. But up until now, they've been allowed to have the authority that they have, but only as long as it serves Rome's interests. So this shows us all the groups, right? Whether it's Herodians, Pharisees, Sadducees, it doesn't matter. It shows none of them actually care about the truth. They don't care about the well-being of the people. It's all politics, and the ways of God get in the way of politics. So this is why they're prepared for a time to team up to eliminate Jesus, because they all hate in their own way what he stands for. And they all want control over their own little kingdom. And despite being religious rulers, at least two of them, they actually hate God. That's the incredible thing about it. They know what they're doing. They hate God that much. And this kind of blindness, this hatred of God and for what his kingdom stands for, well, the point is, it happens today as well. That's a lesson for us now. The same thing happens today. It's always been going on, and it's been going on for the last couple of thousand years since this happened. Because the simple fact is the world hates Jesus. So as his followers, we've got to be prepared for the fact the world is going to hate us too. Because Jesus even warned about this. In John 15, he clearly said, if you are of the world, it would love you as its own. Instead, the world hates you because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. And this is, of course, a recurring pattern in the early church. As the world hates God, it hates his church, and therefore it hates his followers. In fact, when we look through history, the only time the church was ever liked by the world is when it actually looked mostly like the world. That the only time the church has ever really been loved is when it stopped acting like a church and became like the world that it existed in. It just went along with society. Which means that if you hold to the teachings of the Bible, you're not going to be accepted by a world hostile to all that it stands for. And this is why we've got to be prepared for the world to have a go at us for our faith. Be prepared, because there are people who hate each other. We see this in our own society. There are different groups. They hate each other. Atheists don't like Muslims. Muslims don't like radical progressives. They all hate each other. But what we often find is, if given the chance to make the church look bad, to make Christians look bad, well, just like here 2,000 years ago, they amazingly somehow managed to work together to attack God and God's people. But this is why even today, people still conspire against God and his church, because whilst the players, the groups have changed, the attitude and the motive is the same. But this then leads to the second thing to learn from this, which is, if we know that we're going to come under this attack, if we know that this is what's going to happen, then we need to look at how Jesus dealt with it. And what we see here is, when the Pharisees and Herodians came to him and asked him a question, we read in verse 15, he said, "Why are you trying to trap me?" And this shows Jesus knew what was going on. He knew this was a conspiracy. He even called it out. So it shows he's not ignorant of how the world works, and he called out their sin. And just as important, when he called it out, he still dealt with their question. He just taught them. He just corrected them. He used their own words against them. And that means we see Jesus never turned to violence. He never used their sneaky tricks against them. He didn't fight fire with fire, and he didn't play dirty. He just used the truth to expose their lies. So when he saw what was happening, he engaged with them anyway. He still responded to them, but he did it in kindness. And he didn't back down. He was strong. We see that. He confronted them directly, but not in a hostile way, not in the way that they're willing to play. And there's a lesson in that, because as the world will hate the church and will hate Christians and will hate even us, we must not return hate with hate. Then we must not be naive that this is what's going on. Jesus knew it was a trap. He knew their intentions. And as I said before, people will use these kind of things against us. This is why people will talk about love your neighbor. The moment they disagree with us, they'll say, oh, you're not loving your neighbor. They're going to use those words against us. It's a trap. That's what's going on. But we see he didn't sink to their level, and he didn't retaliate by their ways. He just corrected them. When they misunderstood the scriptures, he corrected them. Just like today, we have to do the same thing. And there is a reason why we don't have to retaliate. There's actually a reason why we can keep calm and why we can do that with such confidence. Because as we see here, and as we see if we look at what happened after this, when we get to Easter, when we get to the resurrection, when we look at the rest of the New Testament, when we look at Revelation, when we look at what will be the new kingdom when it arrives, what we're constantly being reassured, what we're being told is God's ways always win out. Because you only got to ask yourself the question, right? Where are the Herodians today? Or where are the Sadducees or the Pharisees? Or how about even the Roman Empire? What we see is all these groups, they all had their day in power. But all political entities that rise, they inevitably fall. So here today, 2,000 years later, they're all gone. Back then, they tried to stop Jesus. They even had him killed. But they're all gone now. They've all disappeared. But as for the followers of Jesus, well, what we see is today they're all over the earth, including in this room. And that's because God's kingdom is bigger than any conspiracy that could ever possibly bring it down. So until Jesus returns, these groups that oppose God, they're going to come and go. And whilst these three we looked at today weren't the last, and today there are many hostile groups that hate God and his kingdom, what we know is they too will disappear over time. So we have no need to oppose them ourselves, because what we know is God will take care of them. God's ways always win out. So the main thing to know is, the main thing to get from this morning is that the fight today against the church, it's real. The conspiracies still continue on, and it can even get a bit demotivating at times. Because if we turn on the news at night, we'll often see, there's another group trying to ban or oppress the church in some way, trying to stop God's ways. But the good news is their fight is against God. And as it's against God, like those in this passage, it's a fight they can't win. So for us now, all we need to do, put our faith in Jesus, stand strong in his teaching, and just let those who conspire against the church answer to him.